reading those testimonials. I don't often go back and look at those, and it's perfect time for me to rehear some of those words. So I really appreciate you doing that research and bringing those forward. For me, that was a gift for me this morning, so thank you so much. We're talking about the Serenity Prayer today, an update of the Serenity Prayer for the times that we're facing currently. You may have heard this update before, you may have not, but it goes something like this. God, grant me the wine to accept the things I cannot change, the coffee to change the things that I can, and the opaque mug so nobody knows what I'm drinking. I'm just kidding, that's not what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about the actual Serenity Prayer today. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Oftentimes, aside from perhaps people who are in recovery, the Serenity Prayer seems to be used more as an excuse for inaction rather than a call to action. Often, at least in my own experience, I find myself more on the end of, well, something I can't change, so I guess I just might as well go watch Netflix for a couple hours and not do anything. Where in actuality, if we really look deeply at the Serenity Prayer and shift our perspective around it, it is a prayer that calls us to action all the time, regardless of whether we find ourselves looking at the serenity to accept what we cannot change or the courage to change the things that we can. And so given the context of our experience right now in the world, with COVID, with the resurgence of the civil rights movement, with all of the big things happening in society, and all of the smaller things happening in our own lives because of all the big upheaval and the change, it's a good opportunity to take a look at the Serenity Prayer, to go deeper into it so that it becomes part of our spiritual practice for action and actually being the change we want to see in the world rather than an excuse to sit back and do nothing. So we're going to look at all three of the key components of the Serenity Prayer today. The serenity to accept what we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, but we're going to begin at the wisdom to know the difference. You've probably heard this phrase before. The wisdom to know the difference is really not very difficult. Simply put, I have complete and total authority in my own consciousness. Anything that I say, think, feel, and do, I have the power to change. I have no authority in the consciousness of anybody else. This means that while I can always change myself, I cannot change anybody else. I also cannot change directly any systems or structures or organizations that involve people outside of myself for the same reason. Those are made up of people with their own consciousness in which I have no authority to make a change. Simply put, the wisdom to know the difference says if it's something I'm saying, thinking, feeling, or doing, I can change it. If it's not, I can't. Now, we often find frustration in this wisdom. There is so much we see out in the world that we want to change, and yet to think that we cannot change anything about it finds us feeling tense and frustrated and discouraged. But part of the reason for that is because we're looking at this last piece of the Serenity Prayer as an ending rather than the bottom of a cycle. Rather, when we find ourselves looking at something we cannot change, instead of saying, well, this must be the end, we can instead go right back up to the top and say, well, if I cannot change this particular thing that I'm finding frustrating at the moment, what can I change? Where do I have power and authority? Maybe I'm looking at a particular person in my life who I love and who I connect with, but is showing up in a way that I don't approve of and want to change them, want to force them to see things the way I see things. And I recognize I can't do that. So instead I can say, well, what's the bigger picture here? What's the broader thing that this person is representing? Where do I really find my own self showing up in relation to this idea? And how can I then go back and ask again, what is it that I can change? And when we come to a place of saying, here is something I can change that is related to what I'm looking at, we have the authority to then move forward. But you really, when we think about it, this idea that I can change myself, but I can't change anybody else, and that we find frustration there, it's good to take a step back and realize that it's actually the way we want it. We want the system set up that we cannot change anybody else, which may sound weird until you think about the flip side of that. If the system were such that I could force a change in somebody else's consciousness without their willingness, acceptance, or approval, then by the same token, they could change my own consciousness without my willingness, acceptance, or approval. And who here is willing to give up the sovereignty in their own consciousness, right? None of us. We all want the power and the authority to have full reign in our own beingness. And so to think that we get frustrated because we can't change other people, when in reality we don't want other people to change us, we begin to see the conflict there, right? And it gets easier to take a step back and say, well, wait a second. I don't want them to change me. So how can I instead change myself? What can I do in the broader context of this topic to actually have an impact? The wisdom to know the difference is simple. I can always change myself, but I can't change anybody else. And it also includes the wisdom to know that this is not a dead end in the prayer, but a cycle to take us back up to the very top and ask again and ask again and ask again until we find something that we can take action on. You see, it's frustrating when we feel like there's nothing we can do. So if we ask again, we'll find what we can do and then be propelled into action. But looking at the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, right? Because so often, if the only thing I can change is myself, and I can't change anybody else, and I can't change systems and structures and organizations outside of myself, there's a lot there that I can't change, which is really easy for me to see and put my attention on. So let's look at this idea of accepting the things we cannot change. The first thing to note here is that the Serenity Prayer is a very poetically written prayer. It is not necessarily an accurately written prayer. The serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference is very poetic. It flows very smoothly, but it gives the idea that when we see something we cannot change, we just have to accept it, be resigned to it. It is the way it is. It's always going to be that way. There's nothing I can do about it because I just have to accept the things that I cannot change. Friends, we do not have to accept the things we cannot change. Written more accurately, this line would say, grant me the serenity to accept that I cannot change the things that I cannot change. Because I can't change something doesn't mean that it can't change, right? Everything in the world is changeable, moldable, movable. It just is whether or not I have the direct and personal authority to make those changes and make those movements, just like we already said. I don't want anybody mucking about in my consciousness, so I shouldn't want to be mucking about in other people's consciousnesses as well. But when I have the serenity to accept that I cannot change the things that I cannot change, I stop wasting my efforts and my energy trying to change those things, and instead have that energy to place where I can make a positive change. And think about it. How many of us have had somebody try to force a change on us, right? We've all had that experience. What happens when that happens to you? If somebody comes at you saying, oh no, you're wrong, you should think about things this way, you should look at things this way, what about this, what about that? How often do you sit and go, well, let me contemplate that, that's a good point? Or is it more likely that we become defensive? We back up into a corner. We root into the belief that we've already had to the thing that's being challenged. It's human nature that when we are confronted in such a way, we tend to go within, we tend to push back, we tend to fight, we tend to get rooted in the very thing that I might be trying to change about somebody else. So not only is it wasted energy, we're lucky if it's wasted energy when we try to force change on things that are not within our authority to change. Wasted energy simply means things stay as they are. That's the lucky outcome. More likely is that we actually root in the things that we want to change more powerfully than they were before, because we're putting our effort into forcing change on other people. Now, no wonder we get frustrated, right? No wonder we feel exhausted. Not only are we wasting energy running up against a brick wall, but we're actually more likely accomplishing the opposite of what we want. The serenity to accept that I cannot change the things that I cannot change helps me to not waste my time and my effort where it is not possible for me to make a change, and focus on where I can. I can always change myself, but I cannot change anybody else. There's a wonderful old saying that I love, and I maybe use a little bit too much, that is a perfect representation of this. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? If you see a horse that is dying of thirst in the desert, you can drag that horse to the Rio Grande, have it chest deep in all of that water, and it may not choose to take a drink. You can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Center for Universal Oneness is also a really great example of this idea. Center for Universal Oneness can have Sunday services. They can change locations to a new location only to have COVID strike and then have to pivot again to Zoom so that you can still connect and have services where people share spiritual ideas and practices, but they can't make anybody engage in those spiritual ideas and practices. Now, if we look at the horse example, how many of us out in the wilderness, seeing a horse dying of thirst, would look at that horse and say, can't make you drink, so I guess if you decide you want to drink, you're going to find water on your own. Good luck to you, and walk off. None of us would do that, right? We would take that horse to water, even though we can't make it drink. Center for Universal Oneness. There's a board meeting coming up, right? Do you suppose that board is going to sit there and say, well, you know, we can't really force a spiritual practice on anybody else, so we might as well just close up shop. Why are we wasting energy if we can't force people to engage in a spiritual practice? Of course they're not going to do that. They're going to find new and innovative ways that they can bring spiritual ideas to people, even though they can't force people to adopt those or to practice those. Why? Because you focus on what you can do, not what you can't do, right? We don't waste our energy thinking, well, I can't make the horse drink. I can't force somebody to a spiritual practice. What can I do? I can bring the horse to water. I can create the environment for the horse where it is more likely to be able to do what it needs to do to fix the problem in its own experience. I can't force a spiritual practice on anybody, but I can help create the environment, the atmosphere, where it's more likely that they will engage in a meaningful spiritual practice that will change their life. It's not about focusing on what we can't do. It's about focusing on what we can do. And in the focusing on what we can do, we create the atmosphere and the environment where it is more likely for the people and the situations and the policies and the programs and the groups that we want to change will do the change on their own, which is exactly, again, going back to the beginning, how we want it. We want it set up that everybody has their own authority and gets to grow on their own way and have their own ideas and their own sovereignty in their consciousness. I can always change myself, but I can't change anybody else. If I'm focusing on what I can't change, I'm going to find frustration and I'm not going to do anything. If I focus on what I can, myself, anything I say, think, feel, and do, I have the opportunity to not only have a positive impact in my own life, but then create the atmosphere and the environment where it's more likely for other people to change as well. So that brings us to the courage to change the things that we can. It's interesting how easy it is for us to look out at the world and find fault with other people, with other organizations, find things that need to be changed in other people instead of looking at ourselves. This is part of the courage, right? Because it's so much easier to find fault with others than it is to turn that same light of awareness back on ourselves and really have an objective observation of the gap between our aspirational values and our lived values. There's always going to be a gap, friends. We will always have aspirational values, these things that we're striving for, these grand ideals of unconditional love, of perfect peace, of compassion. And then we're going to have our lived values, which is where we are, how we're doing on the road to reaching those aspirational values. And the only problem comes when we're too busy looking at the aspirational values and judging other people against the aspirational values that we hold, to stop and look back at ourselves and say, where am I in my lived values versus my aspirational values? And how can I begin to step into that gap to begin to close it so that I move ever forward in the embodiment of these grand ideals that we talk about? Now, typically, what I have seen in myself, what I've noticed in other people around the world as we speak, as we engage in new thought, right? There are 4 aspects of our consciousness: the things we say, think, feel, and do. It's also much easier for us to focus on the things we think and the things we feel and not spend so much time on the things we say and the things that we do. Again, this is part of this courage, right? If I'm focusing solely on the things I think and the things that I feel, that's an internal experience. Nobody needs to know about it. Nobody needs to see it. Nobody needs to be able to comment on it or push back against it. But when I start to change the way I speak and the things that I do out in the world, then it becomes public. then there's the opportunity for people to push back. There's the opportunity for failure in a way that people can see and then make fun of us for. There's all of the fears and the doubts and the worries that can come in when we're more public in who we are. So it takes even greater courage to change the things that we can on a holistic basis, including thinking, feeling, saying, and doing. And yet, when we look at the example of the horse that needs to be led to water, if we come across this horse and we say, you know, let me sit here and work deeply on what I think and how I feel about this horse dying of thirst, that horse is not getting a step closer to water. It's the things we say and the things we do that are going to create the environment, that are going to build the atmosphere, that makes it more likely for other people to change. And to the degree that we ignore the things we say and the things that we do for just what we think and feel, we're not going to create that atmosphere. We're not going to make change on a broader scale more likely. I have a really good example from my own life recently to share with you. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are big things in society right now. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of change, there's a lot of upheaval. There's also a lot of things in our own individual lives, and this applies across the board. So though my example from my own life is going to be about the current expression of the civil rights movement, take it for what you will, adjust it in your own consciousness to what's present for you. This isn't about promoting a particular idea or way of being in the world, it's about the practice behind this experience as an example. So, when the situation with George Floyd first happened, my wife and I realized that we needed to do a lot of self-education. So we began this self-education, which included participating in a class on anti-racism. And in that process, it became clear for us that we had been focusing solely on the thinking and the feeling part. We hadn't done much doing or speaking about what we felt was right and proper and appropriate in the world and how we relate to each other. And so when I thought about what I could do, what was something that I might be able to do, the kindness is everything sign came into my mind right away. You've probably seen this sign. It says, in this house, we believe Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, love is love, science is real, kindness is everything. So I wanted to put this sign in my yard. I wanted to have that be a statement of what I believe in terms of oneness and loving and compassion. And so I did my research. I found who wrote the sign, who created the artwork around it. They had donated the rights to a women's organization in Wisconsin, I believe, and I looked them up to find out which of those crafty, creative sites they had given the trademark to be able to raise money for themselves. Excuse me, I need more wine and or coffee. So I found the right site and I ordered the sign. Now this, of course, is one of those sites that doesn't make the sign until you order it. And they don't ship 2 days for free like Amazon. Amazing that things used to not be that way, right? So I had to wait about 6 weeks to get this sign, several weeks in production and then about a week in shipping, unless I wanted to pay an additional $20, which I didn't want to do. So I'm excited, right? I'm looking forward to getting my sign and putting it in the yard. And then I get the email that says, your sign has shipped. It's on its way to you. And then I started to get a little nervous. I started thinking, well, where am I going to put this sign in my yard? If I put it in that 3 feet swath of grass between the street and the sidewalk, it'll be really easy for somebody to vandalize that sign or somebody to steal the sign. And maybe I have to put it up in the main portion of my yard so that it's not so easy for somebody to reach it. They would actually have to come in my yard if they wanted to vandalize my sign. But if I have it too far up in my yard, it can't really be seen. So I need to have it far enough down that people can see it, but not so far that it's easy for people to vandalize. And oh my God, what if somebody then gets really upset at me for this sign and vandalizes my house? Oh my God, what are the repercussions for me gonna be because I'm putting this yard sign in my yard? Now, we have the full authority to change anything in our consciousness, right? I could have sat there and judged myself. What in the world, Ben? Why are you concerned? It's a sign. There are signs all up and down the neighborhood on different things. Signs and people supporting people in having a good experience even though they're stuck at home. There are all kinds of signs in this neighborhood. Why am I really so concerned that this one sign is going to somehow cause my house to be firebombed, right? The amazing thing about how far we can take our fears before we actually stop and recognize, wait a second, this is so far out of proportion with what's actually going on. I could have judged myself. I could have shamed myself, but I didn't. I tried to pass the buck. We got the sign, I put the sign together, I handed it to Sherry, my wife, and I said, hey, why don't you go put this in the yard? And she looked at me with that loving look that says, oh, hell no, and handed the sign right back to me. She said, I'm not the one who has an issue with where this sign goes in our yard. You go put it where you want it. Because she has no authority in my consciousness to make the changes for me, right? If she had put the sign where she wanted it, and I had claimed that I had done the work because, look, here's this sign in my yard that I didn't actually take the action to put there, I would be disingenuous. It would be claiming growth that wasn't mine. It would be inappropriate. And it wouldn't be me at all stepping in to the fullness of changing the things that I can. I would have been avoiding doing the work to change the feelings that I was having in my body about putting up a sign when I am perhaps one of the most privileged people in our country. If I had more money or was cute as Brad Pitt, maybe I'd be a little more privileged. But otherwise, I'm pretty much right up there, right? So I took a deep breath and I went out and I put the sign in the yard on that swath of grass that's 3 feet between the street and the sidewalk. Because for me, my concerns about what might happen because I put a sign in the yard are insignificant compared to the lack of me engaging in a spiritual practice that includes what I say and what I do. And this was a way for me to speak and a way for me to act in a small way that has me more in alignment and integrity with who I am. It was uncomfortable putting the sign out there. And then a funny thing happened. This is one of those signs that is a vinyl pocket that slips over a metal frame. The next day, there was a big storm. One of the seams on this vinyl pocket split, so the sign came down. I re-glued that seam and I got the chance to go put it back in my yard a second time. And it was easier. And then the next week I had to mow the lawn, so I took the sign down so I could mow the lawn, and then I put the sign back again. And then I did that the next week and the next week. And over again, I stepped into the action that at one point was uncomfortable, that at one point was difficult, even though I knew it was right for me to do it. It was right for me to engage in the spiritual practice of changing what I can in my consciousness with an extra focus on the things that I say and the things that I do, because I know that I have a tendency to not engage in that. And it became easier, it became more natural, it became more comfortable. It changed me. I changed myself. Another great example of this, the minister at Centers for Spiritual Living in Kansas City, my home spiritual center these days, talked recently about his participation in the Prayer on Truth rally. This was several weeks ago. And in thinking about this, I thought, is there one person that he could point to who was changed because he showed up at that rally? The answer is, well, yes, he could point to himself, right? Just like I was changed by taking the action of putting the sign in my yard, so too was he changed by stepping into the atmosphere created by the thousands of people who showed up. That energy, that atmosphere, that call for change, him stepping into that to contribute his energy to creating that greater atmosphere of change, uplifted him, supported him, made him more likely to step out again in what was right for him to do. Not that this is what's right for you to do, but what was right for him to do. And while he couldn't point to any particular individual who was changed aside from himself and say, this person right here was changed because I specifically showed up, we can certainly point to the fact that everybody who drove down Troost on that day, who saw the thousands of people there demanding change, who felt the atmosphere and the energy that they were creating, were changed by that energy, by that atmosphere. Some were changed a lot. Some were changed very minimally. It doesn't matter that we know what the results of our actions are and the benefit of other people, so much as it does that we know that we are doing our work to change our consciousness, and that then helps to create the atmosphere for change to happen around us. A part of that class that I mentioned earlier on anti-racism, one of the teachers was a wonderful unity minister from Massachusetts named Reverend Ogun Holder. And he said, there's a lot of things that we can do, whether it's in relation to the new civil rights movement or in relation to whatever is going on in your own personal life. There's a whole lot of things we can do. We can donate money. We can write letters. We can share our personal experience on social media. We can put a sign in our yard. We can show up at a rally. We can do so many things. The point is not to judge what lane we're in. The point is to pick a lane and start driving. Again, in whatever circumstance you are facing. Even if it's a small thing in your own life that needs changed, but so far you've been unwilling to do anything to change it because, well, I can't really change anybody else, so let me just go watch Netflix, right? It's not about judging what is right for us to do in the moment. It's about picking a lane and starting to drive. After a while, we'll notice that we're on cruise control. Maybe then it's time to consider changing lanes. I'm on cruise control. My sign is cruise control. The mask that I ordered that says the same thing for when I go out in public is now cruise control. It's time for me to find my next way to engage in being the change that I want to see in the world. It's so easy for us to throw that line out from Gandhi, right? Be the change you want to see in the world. Be the change you want to see in the world. And then the only change we ever engage in is the internal change that doesn't really have an impact on the world outside of ourselves. To be the change we want to see in the world means we have to be in the world, changing ourselves in a way that includes the wholeness of our consciousness. Not just what we think and feel, but what we say and what we do as well. And in this time, given that for many of us, not all of us, but that for many of us, it is so much easier to focus on what we think and we feel rather than including what we say and what we do. It might take a little extra effort, a little more awareness, a little more attention towards that aspect than the thinking and the feeling. But as we engage together, that holistic nature, recognizing that I may not be able to change anybody else, but I can always change myself. That I have the serenity within myself to accept that I cannot change the things that I cannot change, but knowing that it is possible for them to change. And that one thing that I can change is the energy and the atmosphere around me, because that's not part of somebody else's authority, right? I have the authority to change that by doing my own work, focusing on, yes, what I think and what I feel, but also what I say and what I do in a public way to lead the horse to water, regardless of whether or not that horse chooses to drink, to provide the opportunity for you to contemplate your spiritual practice, to engage more deeply in something like the Serenity Prayer, even though we can't make you do it, because we put the focus on what we can do. And in doing so, become the change we want to see in the world. It is an honor and a privilege to drive the road with you. Regardless of what lane you're in or what lane I am in, it's great to be on the road together. Let's take a moment now to take this into a practice of meditation. So if you're willing, find yourself comfortable in your chair and allow your outer eyes to close, to be more present to that inner world. Just take a deep breath in and let out a sigh, just to help settle us into that inner space. And as we breathe in, as we connect to our heart center, to that place that knows and knows that it knows, to that higher Christ consciousness, to that spark of light that is the center of our being. Breathing into that spark of light, we begin to see it more clearly. shining more brilliantly in the darkness. We recognize that light as us. And as we throw more attention at the light that we are, as we throw more energy at the light that we are, as we throw more loving into the light that we are, we begin to see the light that we are expand and grow, become brighter, more beautiful, more brilliant, more powerful. And so continue to put the loving and the light and the energy into your brilliant divine self, watching it grow bigger and bigger and bigger, out beyond your house into your community. As your vision expands, you begin to see other pinpricks of light, representing other people, other divine ideas, other divine expressions of spirit. And you notice that as your light begins to brightness the darkness around them, those pinpricks of light begin to expand as well, growing toward the light that you have created in this environment. Not focusing on those other lights, simply focusing on your light. Your light begins to grow and expand. The other lights begin to grow and expand in response, and they begin to merge. Your light, the other light. So much greater individually than they were individually, so much greater than two together would be. The multiplicity of the living light of unconditional love that is our nature, connecting with everybody else around us. We can allow our perspective to shift up even further. Envision the planet from space, seeing all these pinpricks of light all over the planet. Billions of lives, billions of expressions of spirit. Watch the cascade of those lights growing and expanding as yours grows and expands and others happen to connect with it and happen to grow towards it. Not because you're forcing them to grow or change, but because you are growing and changing yourself. The cascade grows faster, grows stronger, grows more powerful, moving quicker over the planet until all that you see is the entire planet surrounded in light and loving, connected oneness, a universal oneness centered in your heart as the source of the light that you focused on growing and changing, and that happened to benefit the world. Taking a deep breath, allow that brilliantly shining globe of light that is the planet to become smaller and smaller in your awareness until it is that pinprick of light where we began, in the center of your being. Recognizing that the totality of the light of spirit, the totality of a world connected and loving, is already present in the core of your being, ready and waiting for you to turn your attention to it in whatever way is right for you, to be the change you want to see in the world, whatever that change is, for the highest good of all concerned. Let's take another deep breath. Allow your attention to come back into your body. Maybe begin to wiggle your fingers and your toes, stretch your neck, whatever is right for you to come back into the present moment. And when you are ready, allow your eyes to open and be here now. Namaste.
Wow. Oh, Ben, I'm captivated. Anybody have anything they want to say about what Ben just said?
Mickey, I got one of the signs that Ben got, and it started because someone posted it in a yard and took a picture of it, and then comments started coming about that's not what we want our community to be, right? And so it created a backlash, and there must be 100 of those signs in our community now.
Wow. Well, you know, that's good news and bad news, right? It created a shift. Ben, that's sort of what you were talking about. We can't control what the reaction will be, but it created an environment for thinking differently, or at least thinking about it and being alert. I guess that's kind of the overarching message that I heard, that if it promotes awareness and alertness and different ways of thinking, or even thinking at all about a new topic, then our work here is moving forward.
And here's
At the
something
same
else
time,
too.
you don't even need to worry about how it's going to impact the world around you. As long as we're focusing on where we have the power and authority, particularly what we say and what we do, the rest will take care of itself.
Beautiful.
We have spoken and thought about so many times the idea of our individual ways of being, and then seeing how impactful and productive we can be as one. And you laid that out for us perfectly. It was we can we lead ourselves to water and then drink too? I kept thinking. So it's and drink with our fellow drinkers. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought too. Well, Ben, just huge thank you. That was really brilliant and beautiful. And I personally am very grateful, and I'm seeing thumbs up and claps. And so while you can't hear our roaring applause, know that if we were in person, we'd be up on our feet, sending you kisses and throwing roses at your feet. So thank you. That was really wonderful. So